Hello and good morning to today's Talk at 10. We are delighted that this webcast is one of the official Circular Economy Week events. C Week this year takes place amid growing calls to build back better after the coronavirus crisis. On this morning's bumper edition of the programme, over the next 90 minutes, we will be exploring how to establish a sustainable, low-carbon recovery by looking at global macro trends, the changes needed to marketplace rules, the future of sustainable aviation, sustainable transport within our cities, and planning for a resilient future. So lots of ground to cover. My panel this morning are Mark Davey, UK Sales and Marketing Manager at Singapore Airlines, German Dr. Vega, co-founder of The Future Fox, Simon Holmes, member of the UK Competition Appeal Tribunal and visiting fellow at the Centre for Competition Law and Economics, Tony Mulvihill, managing director at Planning for the Best, Richard Roberts, World Business Council for Sustainable Development, Macro Trends and Disruptions Shaping 2020 to 30 Inquiry Lead. That's a long title. He's based at Volans. And West London concert pianist Harriet Stubbs, who's going to be sharing a micro business perspective, as well as treating us to a special performance at the end of the programme. So do stay tuned for that. Throughout the programme, my colleague Pim will be monitoring your questions, so please keep them coming in. Now, as always, I must give a wee plug to our West London Business Support Helpline. I think we're going to bring up on screen now for you the contact details. If your business needs to talk to someone directly, you can call the team on 020 8607 2500, and there's the website, of course, coronavirus.westlondon.com. This is an important week for many businesses in West London, as some of the discretionary grants are now becoming available from our local authorities. So I know a lot of businesses wanting to find out more about what the criteria will be for those grants if they're looking to put applications in as a result of not being able to access other schemes. This webcast, as I mentioned, is of course part of CE Week London, which is brought to you by Circular London as well as LWARB, the London Waste and Recycling Board. But as with all of our webcasts in recent months, it is very kindly supported by Better Futures, which is the Mayor of London's flagship programme to create a clean tech cluster in London. Now, if you're wondering how to get involved in Better Futures, whether it could apply to your business, to be eligible, you must be an SME, which means up to 249 employees with a turnover under 50 million euros per annum. You need to have a London address. You need to have or be about to develop a clean technology. That's any product that has a good impact on the environment. Your balance sheet should be below 43 million, and your business can't be a subsidiary or under the control of one or several other enterprises. So if you tick those boxes, or think you might, please contact any member of the West London business team with a short summary of your project to find out more. So, let's get down to business. On the programme today, we're going to be covering global trends, marketplace rules, the future of aviation, sustainable cities and transport, a micro-business response to COVID-19, and planning for a resilient future. So lots for us to get through in the next 90 minutes as we move from the macro level down to the micro, and hopefully make lots of exciting connections in between. Now, as always, at the start of Talk at 10, I like to turn to our panel just to get their take on how the world is changing, because it changes so fast at the moment, in just a matter of days or even hours. But before we hear from the panel, I'm going to bring up on screen the results of a recent survey that the team at WLB found fascinating from communications agency Futerra. They have conducted a poll just a few weeks ago, both in the US and the UK. We're going to bring up the first results now on the screen for you. They asked, should we make as many big lifestyle changes to stop climate change as we are making to stop coronavirus. And as you can see from those results, a huge number of respondents on both sides of the Atlantic saying yes. Their next question, which we're going to bring up now, was to ask, since the lockdown and pandemic, have you changed anything to live more sustainably or be greener? And again, broadly similar results on both sides of the Atlantic. 20% or thereabouts saying yes a lot, around 50% just over saying yes a little, and then 20% saying no, not at all. But where we find some divergence is on the third and final question that we're going to bring up now. So here, the Futerra team asked, in the near future, are you planning to change your lifestyle to be more sustainable? The one area where the UK came ahead of our US cousins was on travel by foot and bicycling more. So that may be something that Germany wants to pick up on. We were at 40% in contrast to the US at 20%. I imagine that our different geographies and population densities may have a bearing there. But where our US friends were way ahead of us was on all the four other areas. They were clearly more committed to eating less meat, eating more local and seasonal food, wasting less, and exercising more. So lots of food for thought there, and really intrigued to hear our panellists' thoughts on that, and also what the world out there feels like to you at the moment. So I'll perhaps bring in first of all Richard. What's your take on the sort of vibe on the street, and any immediate reactions to that Futerra survey?
Thanks, Andrew, and good morning. So first, I feel a little bit conflicted about the vibe on the street at the moment, as it were. We have, on the one hand, globally, a lot to worry about. I think what's happening in the US right now is both tragic and very scary. I think what's happening in Brazil, India, Hong Kong, there are a lot of news stories going in the wrong direction. At the same time, what we're seeing in our work and our conversations at the moment is that we're starting to shift gear from just pure survival mode into thinking about recovery. On Monday this week, lots of people may have seen there was a letter co-signed by more than 200 CEOs to the Prime Minister here, calling for a green recovery package, calling for stimulus measures to be targeted towards low carbon industries, and even for support packages to be given conditionality around aligning with national climate goals. So I think there's lots to be excited about as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely, as you say, a world of contrasts, and the rather grim scenes that we've seen recently in the US. I think we may well want to pick up on later in the programme. Harriet, if I can bring you in as someone that spends part of your life over in the US and part of your life in the UK. What was your take on those results of the Futerra surveys? Is it your experience that people are eating less meat and more local food over stateside?
In New York, definitely. There's a real effort it's changed so much of the time that I've lived there. I've been there for 10 years, and there's a lot more consciousness about sustainability and diet and building a greener future. In terms of how flying moves forward, I think it's very difficult to know right now. But certainly New York is very conscious. The rest of America is quite different. New York is in its own way very independent. But I'm really encouraged to hear that that's the results that they have.
And yes, I mean, as you say, some I suppose challenging times for us in West London, as I think on the one hand, many people have perhaps appreciated quieter skies, but on the other hand, so many of our lives and livelihoods are intrinsically linked to the airport, its success, in your case, your ability to hop on an aeroplane and move between London and New York for performances, it can feel quite conflicted, can't it?
Yes, I think that the coronavirus has made it evident that there is a lot more that we can do remotely without having to be there for every single meeting in person. And I think that the music industry is very focused on how we can do what we do responsibly and work together. Harrison Parrott, who are actually based in the Arc in West London, who I do quite a lot of work with, Jasper Parrott has spoken a lot about sustainability and climate change moving forward, and how their artists are going to commit to climate conscious travel. So it's certainly a situation that we're trying to balance.
Now that's really that's encouraging to hear, and I suppose one of the striking things about this moment in time and moment in our lives is the opportunity it's provided just to pause and think and reflect about how we might do things differently. German, we're going to hear lots more from you shortly about what's sort of happening on the streets and the redesign of the streets. But what's the pandemic felt like for you? By looks of things, you're like many of us. You're working from home this morning.
Yes, I am, and I'll mention that a little bit. I mean, the first things, agree with Richard. The personal situation is very challenging. I have family in Mexico, for example, and I didn't sleep yesterday, just to say the least. From a personal point of view, difficult. From a professional point of view, really interesting. Some of the trends that the survey identified were there already. We had seen an increase in sustainable transport that was coming our way in the US and the UK. I think that the UK is very well prepared to have a massive surge in sustainable transport because the baseline is there, and it seems like the pandemic has accelerated it. And one of the interesting things which were, I don't think, predicted was what you mentioned, the impact that this is going to have on the business trips and the way we conduct businesses. I used to travel quite a lot because of my job, and now I haven't for months, but my work hasn't been impacted. Our team is placed in different parts of the world, and we haven't had to travel. So we're going to go from sustainable mobility to start thinking about reducing our mobility, at least the long distance mobility, and perhaps increase our local mobility. The most fascinating thing I have seen is the connection that people have been able to make between this pandemic, horrible as it is, and mental health and physical health, and the role that our cities and urban planning plays in it. And there's no other way to describe this than we have been absolutely disrupted, and we're all dealing with it, and it's hard, but good things may come out of this.
Indeed, we've picked up on that point around sort of mental health and the huge need to refocus in our workplaces around well-being and health over the past few weeks, and of course Mental Health Awareness Week a few weeks ago on the programme. Tony, can I bring you in just for a quick snapshot of what it's felt like for you as a small business working across West London?
Well, it's been quite an interesting experience, Andrew. The businesses all kind of went into finding funding and figuring out what are we supposed to do now that we have no shops are open, universities shut down. So it's been very quiet from a sort of physical going and visiting people doing things, but it's been a very busy online presence, and people have made that transition online very swiftly and discovered that it's easy to get online, it's easy to get things up and running. And from the sort of personal perspective, I had to have a little trip up to Birmingham to collect one of my daughters whose contract was cut from a production company. So I did that the Thursday before the lockdown occurred. So it's been quite a busy time, and I think people found that, as we talked about with those themes, the transitions are happening, and people are suddenly realizing that maybe I don't need to be in the office all the time. Maybe I don't need to spend 2 hours a day commuting. And am I right? Am I right, Tony, that you're working from a sort of studio office at the end of your garden today? That is correct. Yes, this is my office, and I've got my screen up behind me, and I've worked this way for a number of years, so it's relatively normal to me to work like this, but it's not quite normal to be not in physical contact with people.
Hopefully not too distracted where you're sitting by the lovely sunshine that we had earlier in the week.
No, thank you.
Focused on your laptop, quite rightly.
Yeah.
Mark, we've been talking a lot in these initial reflections around sort of aviation. Of course, Singapore Airlines, based in Chiswick Park, in the heart of West London. What's it felt like for you and colleagues over the past few weeks? I mean, absolutely extraordinary times for aviation.
Well, I mean, it has. I mean, certainly as a global airline, I mean, we've actually been at the coalface for this from the very beginning, so being based in Asia. And obviously, we felt the impact from the early outbreak in China. So we've watched it gradually spread around the world and obviously hit our markets over here, grounding our fleet of 96% of our aircraft. So we've been operating with a very skeletal service. But it's basically been incredible to see how everybody has adapted to their work environment. Office-based staff, commercial administration, working from home. But obviously airport staff who can't work from home and flight crew, etc., who can't work from home have continued to keep going and to keep those essential services open. Flights that we've been operating have obviously, as I said, been skeletal, but been playing a very vital role in repatriating people and also bringing cargo in and out of the UK. So, it's been a very challenging time, but everybody has adapted and rose to the occasion.
Yeah, and fascinating. And is there a sense, do you think, within the sector that perhaps some of the initial shock has now been gotten over, or are you faced with impacts so profound that everyone is still reeling and just trying to process what's unfolding?
I mean, there's no question. It's been unprecedented, and that's a word that's I don't want to underuse, but it really has. But I think it's really just now kind of looking to see what are we moving forward into. And from our business, obviously, we talk about environmental issues, but we're in the business of air travel, so obviously, that's a very core issue that comes to us. But moving out of this COVID-19 scenario, we also have to look at where we can operate, where global borders are starting to open. And what is the demand going to be like? And there's lots of unanswered questions that obviously we're going to have to learn over the coming months and years. And this could take 2 to 3 years to get back to some state of normality, if it gets back to the state of normality which we enjoyed. So it's a case of being flexible and adaptable.
So I'm sure a keen focus on the discussions that are happening around where some of those first air bridges might open up in and out of the country. So we'll perhaps come back to that later. Simon, by no means last, but by no means least in our round of introductions. What are the past few months been like for you, adjusting to COVID-19 and those that you're working with?
Well, I share Richard's concern of a conflict and almost a guilt, I think, because to be honest, not much has changed for me. I wasn't going out to work every day anyway. I've been involved in no court cases recently, although the court is continuing to work. So I've been able to spend a lot of time writing and speaking virtually, of course, mainly about climate change, sustainability and competition law. And when I'm not doing that, I've been out riding my bike, getting the exercise you were talking about. And frankly, that's been wonderful. It's been the best spring ever for so many of us. But as I say, it's tinged with guilt. And I feel guilt as well because my wife is a frontline NHS consultant. So I've been trying to support her through times of stress. And I have a daughter locked down with us because she was caught by the US travel ban. So he's down with us. So yeah, it's sort of mixed feelings. But on a very personal level, guilty pleasures.
So a strange polarisation.
I could comment on the survey as well.
Go on, Simon.
Yeah, very much so. And somebody mentioned mental health a moment ago. I understand the mental health issues and analytically across the population, but what one has also seen an awful lot of very positive mental attitudes. I've seen more families out together. joyful scenes of fathers running daughters on bikes, all sorts of things with better health, better family together, and I'm well aware that is juxtaposed against the stresses that others.
The community response, as you say, has been wonderful to watch unfold and hugely reassuring. I think sort of across West London and the sort of wider UK. But as you reflect, we've got polarisations both across society but also within our families, as to how individuals' lives and livelihoods have been so very differently impacted. Now we're going to move back from the micro to the global macro sort of view now, and it's my great pleasure here to sort of bring in Richard to start to sort of talk us through the work that you've been doing in recent times with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the themes that were emerging before the crisis, and sort of how the crisis is now perhaps putting a slightly different complexion on that. So over to you, Richard, and I think we'll sort of bring up a few slides as you go for a quick intro.
Thanks, Andrew. So yeah, we at Volan started working with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is a organisation that brings together 200 plus companies around the world to look at what this decade ahead, what the 2020s might bring. We started that work late last year, obviously before anyone had heard of COVID-19, and published this report recently that you see on screen, although actually most of the research was done pre-COVID-19. We obviously then had to do some updating. And the purpose of that is really to help the WBCSD and its member companies think about how do we build towards a world in which potentially 9 billion plus people by the middle of this century can live well within the means of the planet. And what does that mean for all of the different businesses that we work with? What does that mean for all of the different industries and sectors that we can look at? And of course, so as part of that, we looked at what are some of the potential, back in, when we did this work back in October, November, we talked about wildcard disruptions. Now, number 2 on that list was a global pandemic. Of course, that no longer feels like a wild card. So partly what we've experienced in the last couple of months is a reminder simply that disruptions, wildcards do happen. But I think more profoundly than that, what we're seeing now with COVID-19 is the pandemic interact with a whole range of the other trends and issues that were already there before this year started, in ways that in some cases accelerate developments that were already underway. So some examples here. We're certainly seeing COVID accelerating the trend towards simpler, shorter supply chains. Something that because of US-China trade tensions, technological developments, this was happening already, but is now kind of going into fast forward. Similarly, on that's a sort of mixed story. There are positives and negatives to that, I would say. On the other side of the screen, this mouthful of a word, autocratization. I knew I would stumble over that. There was a study published last year that found that during the 2010s, the number of countries that were moving in an authoritarian direction had overtaken the number of countries moving in a democratic direction for the first time since the Second World War. And unfortunately, one of the things we're seeing now is more of a drift towards authoritarianism in many countries where democratic norms and institutions were already weakening. A second way the COVID crisis is interacting with trends that were already there is it's exacerbating some of the kind of existing divisions and tensions we had within society. So clearly the economic fallout from this crisis will shape our societies for a long time to come. And one important aspect of that is we know from past recessions that age cohorts that enter the job market during a downturn do less well, not just at the start of their careers, but decades later may still be earning less than the cohorts before and after them. So when you overlay that effect on top of already some pretty significant divergences between the views and values of, if we kind of talk about the baby boomers at one end of the spectrum and Gen Z at the other, you potentially have a recipe for some pretty serious intergenerational political conflict over the decade ahead. And then the final theme I would say is instability breeds instability, and so there's a real risk and opportunity of a COVID-19 domino effect. So this slide highlights the 10 high-impact potential disruptions we identified before COVID struck. Some are good, some are bad, and all of them have probably become more likely to materialize during the 2020s as a result of COVID-19. So, for example, what we're seeing in the US right now is, I think, one indication of the destabilizing effect that COVID can have. Now, clearly, the root causes of what we're seeing run much deeper, but it does seem very likely that the pandemic has contributed to a context in which justifiable anger and despair boils over into violence. Likewise, looking at the financial system, so far we've avoided anything like a full-blown meltdown, largely because of the interventions of central banks and governments. But that may have just postponed a financial crisis rather than averted it. One of the more terrifying statistics we came across in our research is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, published a report last October warning that an economic slowdown half as severe as the 2007-2008 global financial crisis could result in $19 trillion of corporate debt, which is nearly 40% of total corporate debt in major economies, being owed by firms that cannot cover their interest expenses with their earnings. Now, that would be worrying if the COVID crash were only half as severe as the global financial crisis. Unfortunately, we know it's likely to be significantly worse. So there are potentially very serious economic and financial consequences still being stored up. But if I may say one more thing, because I don't want to finish on such a pessimistic note, is I think on the flip side, for this discussion today and for sustainability, there is potentially some very good disruption to come as a result of COVID. We'll talk about transport. I think for the energy transition, we were seeing before COVID happened, most analysts were saying we might see peak fossil fuel demand at some point in the 2030s. Those who were a bit more bullish on renewables were saying mid-2020s. Now those same analysts are saying actually it happened in 2019. The peak was last year. The CEO of BP was interviewed the other day and said, yeah, I think there's a decent chance that we've now passed peak fossil fuel demand. So this is not just kind of environmentalist types who are saying this. This is a real structural change in our economy, and that it will have some very profound consequences for our climate, for the energy system, and indeed for the financial system as well. So I guess the point I'd make is that we've taken a 10-year view, and we're now less than 6 months into the 2020s. So I think one thing it's really important to keep in mind is let's not assume we've already experienced the biggest disruption to business as usual that this decade is going to throw at us.
Goodness, that's a bracing thought for you to end on there. I think picking up on your points around energy, we've certainly seen an accelerating number of businesses in West London choose to buy green energy off the grid, and that is clearly helping drive the marketplace demand and the accelerated investment in renewables that are now available off grid in the UK and elsewhere. I'd be interested, given that you produce reports like this, working with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development to drive changes in businesses. You don't want the reports to sit on the shelf. What's your sense of how these sorts of insights are being internalised and then acted upon by business leaders?
Yeah, so I think it's very important to say that this kind of work, what I've just talked about, is not about a prediction of what the future is going to look like or a forecast. This is about us saying, in order to build credible strategies for how we grow our businesses into the future and how we do that in a sustainable and inclusive way, we have to take some of these factors into account, because otherwise we're not having a real conversation. Now, the real challenge and the interesting piece of the work then is about how we take some of this sort of macro trends data type stuff and turn that into kind of credible pathways and strategies for going forward, and look both at the, maybe I dwelt a little bit more in those remarks on some of the potential negative sides of this, but I think this is very much both a risk and opportunity conversation. We have to think about how we mitigate the risks of just being completely blown off course by stuff that comes up at us this decade, that's political, that's economic, that's environmental. But there are huge opportunities. There are opportunities to build back better. Crises create a context in which real transformation can happen at every level, from individual businesses of any size through to political systems. And so this is an opportunity to test out, to kind of take some of those ideas that perhaps were just too radical or too far-fetched in business as usual times. This is their moment.
We've been very sort of struck in recent days at West London Business at how sort of in the aftermath of George Floyd's tragic death and the abrasive tweets that sort of followed from Donald Trump, how that's forcing both Twitter and Facebook to very deeply reappraise their operating model and their relationship with the outside world, and what that means for them as businesses.
Absolutely, and I think the big tech angle to all this is a very interesting one. I mean, before the George Floyd incident, and maybe Simon will have more to say on this from a competition point of view, one of the unfortunate effects of a crisis like this is that it tends to be better for the bigger players in any industry, who will typically have more cash reserves, more ability to weather the storm than smaller players. And so what we potentially see in a market like technology that was already hugely concentrated and huge power held by Facebook, Amazon, Google, and the like, is that will be further exacerbated by this crisis. So I think there's two sides to that. One is we really have to think about competition in the recovery from COVID-19 and think about how we ensure that the companies that went into this crisis dominant don't come out even more dominant and able to squash competition. But at the same time, I think it's a good sign that, as you say, this week we're seeing Facebook and Twitter and others starting to step up to some of their societal responsibilities in a new way.
Fascinating adjustments that are sort of happening in real time around us at the moment. I'm going to be very keen, I think, a bit later on in the programme to hear from Tony on some of these sort of macro trends, to get a sense of how he feels that they perhaps need to be built into business continuity planning, risk assessments, etc. in businesses in West London, sort of moving forward. But I'm going to take the opportunity now to move us on, as you've just referenced the competition law challenges there, to bring in Simon for our sort of second theme of the morning, around marketplace rules. And I think so over the years, and perhaps more recently, we've spent a lot of time at West London Business talking about the changes that businesses can make internally in terms of their responsible business behaviour, but very often we find that the conversations around sort of wider collaboration with other firms seem to get stuck around fears of competition law breaches. So I wonder, Simon, whether you can perhaps give us a sort of initial introduction to these challenges, and how competition law can sometimes be an issue when businesses look to work together to fight climate change, or to conduct business in a more sustainable way in other areas. Simon.
Yeah, sure. The underlying point, and Richard's alluded to it, is that fighting climate change isn't just a matter for government or individuals, but business can and must play its part. Certainly, regulation is an important part of it. It is often the first choice of policy. but it's often inadequate, it's often too slow, and it's also limited in geography. The regulations are country by country. There's a lot individual businesses can do, but they will often, if they do take steps, they'll suffer what we call a first mover disadvantage. By that we mean that if you, for example, you're an individual car manufacturer and you look to improve your emissions standards, that is likely to increase your costs, and you may not be able to recover them from consumers. Not all consumers are prepared to pay the extra costs. So for this and many other reasons, it's often more effective if businesses cooperate, work together on sustainability issues. And that's where competition law comes in. Because in essence, the core of competition law, the most important bit here, is that it prohibits anti-competitive agreements between companies unless they're exempt. And the trouble is, business, quite rightly in many circumstances, hears a lot about how cooperating with their competitors rather than competing with them can give rise to large fines. And this creates an inordinate fear which inhibits important initiatives. I've seen this myself over 35 years in practice as a lawyer, but also recent empirical evidence is showing this. For example, last month, the law firm Linklaters, with which I have no connection, I would add, did some empirical work with their clients and businesses, which showed that 60% of businesses had walked away from sustainability projects, and that's tragic in my view.
Absolutely fascinating that data that you mentioned from Linklaters, just in terms of the scale of the inhibitions that are out there now. We've sort of picked up over the past few weeks that there's been perhaps some relaxations introduced around competition law by the British government as a result of the crisis. Can you tell me a bit more about how that's played out?
Sure, and I've been trying to bang this home in the climate change context. We need to learn the lessons from the action that's been taken in relation to COVID-19. It's not just the UK, it's over 100 competition authorities around the world have axed, and I use that term loosely, competition law, to make it easier for firms to cooperate, to keep food on our table, to ensure the supply of medical products. And they've done this in one or more of three ways. First of all, they've explained where they won't take action, where people are taking necessary and proportionate measures to, for example, improve and make supply chains work in these difficult times. They've also explained how the exemption criteria will work, and that's all been very constructive. And in some countries, and the UK is one of them, we've actually had some fairly focused, what we call exclusion orders, which have excluded competition law in carefully specified circumstances. Now, this is all good stuff. All good stuff, by the way, is a technical legal term. But if one can do this to fight, I hope, is a short-term crisis, the COVID crisis, then we should consider doing some of these things to fight the more existential threat of the climate crisis.
And that takes us back neatly, Simon, to today's theme of sort of building back better, as we gradually move into a recovery phase. Can you give us some examples of the sorts of collaborations that might happen if there were perhaps some adjustments made, or there was additional comfort provided by the competition authorities?
Yeah, but perhaps I could give you a couple of examples to help the people, the sort of things that we might be talking about, and I'll come back to what the authorities should be doing. And just a couple of examples. One from my own experience just recently. Suppliers and retailers have been working together to ensure that fish that we eat is obtained on a sustainable basis. Perfectly laudable. Anybody outside the competition law bubble would say, well, surely they can cooperate to make sure that we don't deplete the world's fishing stocks. But one company, quite reasonably in a traditional sense, said, well, hang on, if we are agreeing not to buy from a non-sustainable source, that surely is a collective boycott, which is one of the big no-nos, and we could be fined for it. Sorry, my company can't sign up to this. Now, the answer, I'm quite confident that agreement was perfectly lawful. Another example, a few years ago, manufacturers of washing machines agreed to discontinue the least energy efficient means and to pursue joint energy efficiency targets and to develop more environmentally friendly products. It was accepted that the collective benefits to society, reduced energy consumption, etc., outweighed the increased costs. Now, that was allowed in 2000 by the European Commission. The concern is when you listen to the current narrow technocratic rhetoric in the competition world, that sort of thing wouldn't be allowed, and that's tragic. We ought to be allowing more of that. And if anybody wants to see the sort of things that we're talking about in the real world for building back better, they could do no worse than to look at the paper produced by Unilever and submitted to the European Commission in the context of a review it's carrying out. That contains literally dozens and dozens of practical examples of things that business wants to do, needs to do, but risks not happening if people are unduly fearful of competition law.
And so, on a practical, if West London business was to come, and knocking at the door of a group of our members and to bring them round the table to contemplate a voluntary agreement in an area of sustainability action in West London, do you have any sort of tips for the practical steps that we and our member companies might take to try and keep the competition law risks at a minimum?
Sure. Well, many of your members, I would hope, already have competition compliance programs, and if they dust those off and have a look at them, that will be a good start. But I give them 4 tips in this context. First, you need to have a clear reason why you need to work together rather than doing it individually. Secondly, you need to organise it in a way that has the minimum effect on competition. It must be no more restrictive than necessary, as we say. Thirdly, one should identify and ideally quantify, but that's not essential, the environmental and any other benefits. And fourthly, work out the scope of the necessary collaboration and make sure you don't stray outside that. That's where people come adrift. For example, years ago, and I was loosely involved with it, the detergent manufacturers got together to try and reduce the amount of packaging. The amount of packaging you have when you buy some soap or detergent is totally unnecessary. From a technical point of view, you can produce just as much soap by in a small pot, saving transport costs, saving plastic use and so forth. That would be perfectly legitimate. Unfortunately, the discussions which they had in relation to something perfectly legitimate spilled over into price discussions, and they were fined. And that sort of thing makes people nervous, but wrongly. They should have just correctly delineated what they would do and stuck to it.
That's really helpful sort of clarification. We touched upon the role of the competition authorities. Are there sort of specific changes that you'd like to see from the competition authorities to kind of make competition law less of a problem in these sort of responsible business areas?
Yeah, I mean, I've set out in my latest paper some 11 proposals for practical action. But actually, all that is secondary just to a change of approach and attitude. In my view, the existing competition law, if looked at properly and revisited as it was originally intended, is quite capable of blessing or not catching the sort of things that we're talking about. But in the real world, we have a conservative establishment, and we need to see some positive steps from the authorities. We need to see them to spell out in speeches, in press releases, perhaps in positive decisions, in their guidance notes, what it is that you are allowed to do, and of course what you're not allowed to do. But they also need to give people more confidence. The UK's competition authority, the Competition and Markets Authority, has made a good start in that for the first time ever, its annual plan sets out as a strategic objective climate change and supporting the transition to a low carbon economy. Now we need to see how that plays out in what they actually do in terms of press releases and cases and so forth. And indeed, I'm going down to talk to them in a week or two, so I hope to get a better sense of that later this month.
Does sound very, very, very promising and potentially a step change, or the potential for a step change there from the CMA. Just finally, one of the advantages that is often talked about of voluntary agreements and self-regulation in fast-moving sectors is the potential that they offer to be more responsive than legislative routes. However, it has been raised with me that there can be a danger when you price in those external social and environmental costs that you end up leaving vulnerable customers, perhaps households that are on the brink of poverty, dependent on food banks, for example, in our West London context, no longer able to access certain goods and services. How do you think we get around that challenge?
I think I'd make 3 points. First, much as people like me would like to price in some of the externalities, the pollution caused by individual producers doing things in a polluting way, etc., and so forth, that's not always going to happen. What often with the sort of many of the initiatives that we're talking about are simply doing things in a more environmentally effective way, which may or may not have an impact on price. Secondly, vulnerable consumers are a concern, but one mustn't lose sight of the fact that vulnerable consumers are also frequently those most at risk from climate changes. There's a lot of research on that, but just to think of a simple example, vulnerable consumers are more likely to live in overcrowded, polluted areas and suffering from the effects of climate crisis, air pollution, and so forth. And thirdly and finally, in competition law, a fundamental principle is the principle of proportionality. Yes, there will be cases which aren't justified, where the measures aren't justified, where there are small sustainability gains and an increase in price. Competition conferences talk endlessly about the famous chicken of tomorrow case, where small gains to the welfare of chickens was not allowed, and in the face of increased costs. But, and I'll finish with this positive point, if the price of something goes up 1 penny, something which we perhaps don't even need really, and on the positive side, we are helping us to have clean air for our children and our grandchildren to breathe, that in my view is okay. That is a proportionate response. It does lead us to ask, what are our values? What do we value in society? Is it having 1 penny, something 1 penny cheaper for something we didn't really need? Or is it leaving a sustainable future for ourselves and our offspring?
So perhaps ultimately the basket of goods that we consume may need to rebalance as we move towards a more sustainable future. I think that leads us in very appropriately to a brief snapshot view of the future of aviation, and appropriately you may be able to, just as you've possibly heard my doorbell ringing earlier in the programme, you may now be able to hear an aeroplane flying overhead. As there aren't so many at the moment, we do perhaps notice them that bit more. So Mark, we've obviously last month saw a 97% contraction in the number of flights in and out of Heathrow. I'm sure you and your colleagues must be beavering away now trying to figure out how to get flights moving again safely. Where is your thinking currently at on that challenge?
Safely, obviously, that is the priority. It's safety has always been the priority, but we're moving in a different arena now, where health and safety is a focus. So, we're looking at how we can ensure that passengers that travel have a positive experience and a health and a secure experience as well, so that when they're joining on board the aircraft, we've actually had the aircraft flight crew all have their temperatures checked in advance. Passengers are required to wear masks at the moment, as are flight crew. But these are all things that are currently in place at the moment for the flights that are operating. Now, obviously, those measures that we're putting in place may be temporary, because obviously we're not sure as to what will happen going forward and how long that'll be required. But the industry is in a very uncertain situation right now, and there's lots of unknowns. So it's really a case of we're trying to manage based on what the requirements are, or what the restrictions are globally, and how we can play within that.
I've certainly seen sort of some photos in recent days of sort of rather Heath Robinson-like contraptions that would sort of put passengers in a sort of perspex bubble to try and reduce risks. Are your colleagues getting lots of intriguing proposals like that landing on your desks at the moment?
There's lots of marketing opportunities, I think, and I think obviously there's an element that we need to be careful, is that we don't become some kind of space age way of travel. At the end of the day, it's reassuring and building that confidence back up for travellers, and that is obviously what is important for travellers now. Obviously, do they feel safe with the airline that they're choosing to fly with, as far as the health and safety aspect of it, and are they able to connect to the markets that they would traditionally have travelled to? All of these things that the airline has a responsibility to ensure that there is a safe passage for passengers going forward.
Clearly, the abruptness of the decline in air travel has created huge cash pressure on the industry, and we've seen different governments responding in very different ways in terms of how much state aid and where they think that might land. What's your sort of take on what's going to be needed in the months or maybe years ahead to ensure that the industry remains viable on some level?
Yeah. It obviously varies by country, it varies by airline, and obviously varies by government. But one of the things that we need to ensure is that some kind of global coordinated response to border restrictions. Every market has its own restrictions right now, so confidence in travel is obviously at a very low point for business travelers and also those traveling on leisure holidays, for example. It's very confusing where they can travel to. So, obviously there needs to be more of a clear response, which, hopefully, I know IATA has also raised this as well from global markets, that there is a global response to this, so that there is the reassurance that travel can continue.
Because from end to end, of course, from manufacturing airplanes right the way through to those that are keeping our airports clean, it's been absolutely profound, the depth of the and breadth of the impacts that have rippled out there. Now, in just a few moments, I'm going to come potentially to my colleague Pim, who may well be messaging me through some questions from viewers. I've got one eye on my phone for questions from Pim, but equally I may come back to panel colleagues to who may want to put some questions to each other. But so there's a brief warning there. You can give me a wave in a moment or two if you've got a burning question for a colleague. But a sort of final question for you, Mark, sort of picking up on this sort of tension that we discussed at the beginning of the programme between our need as a West London community that is incredibly globally connected, that has thrived and built our economy off our international connections, and yet we know that there is this environmental footprint that we're creating at the same time. At West London Business, we've started carbon offsetting all of our emissions, including our air travel. What's your message at Singapore Airlines to individual consumers that might be travelling for a holiday, but equally business customers, kind of who are struggling with that conflict?
Yeah, well, one way in which we're getting involved is via our participation in a pilot phase of Corsair, which is a global carbon offsetting scheme adopted by the International Civil Aviation Organization, and this requires airlines to buy carbon offsets to compensate for their growth in carbon dioxide emissions. But in addition, we've significantly reduced our carbon footprint over the years by investing in new generation aircraft models, such as the Airbus A350, the Boeing 787. And these are far more fuel efficient aircraft than the ones obviously we're replacing. And obviously this results in a current fleet age, which is, for us, Singapore Airlines, our current fleet age is 5 years and 6 months, which is one of the lowest in the industry and a figure that remains fairly steady. So we're also embarking on a series of green package flights that has helped offset carbon dioxide by combining the use of biofuels, fuel-efficient aircraft and optimized flight operations. So just help to raise awareness of sustainable biofuels for aviation, as well as providing the industry with valuable insights into economics, logistical requirements, and the performance of biofuels. So we regularly seek ways to improve fuel efficiency by optimizing flight routings, engaging in effective aircraft weight management, and using analytics to improve our fuel consumption. So, of course, we all seek to extend environmental conservation efforts beyond just our flight operations. I mean, in our head office, for example, beside what we're doing in the air, we're offsetting around 20% of our electricity, which is powered by solar panels. 12% of our water consumption comes from rainwater, which we harvest for reuse within the office environment as well. So, there's a lot of things that we can do as a business to ensure that we are offsetting and sort of reducing our maintaining our sustainability and maintaining a modern fleet.
That's hugely encouraging to hear, and when you do some of those first sort of green fuel flights out of Heathrow, you must let us know at West London Business so we can give it the appropriate sort of shout out. I'm reminded that I must encourage our viewers that you can make use of the live chat window on YouTube. You do need to have a YouTube or I think sort of Google account to log yourself in and then pose a question in live chat. So do start making use of that. I know one of our viewers, Mukesh Malhotra, has said good morning on the live chat window, so it's working. Just start putting your questions in there. I'm also reminded, Mark, with your reflection on sustainable fuels, that I think in recent days Heathrow Airport have been calling on the British government to identify a site in the UK, probably somewhere in the north of England, to actually get that manufacturing of sustainable fuels moving to scale. But I'm going to turn to the wider panel now. This is your chance to give me a wave. We don't have a hands up tool to put a question to colleagues. So I'm going to go to German first of all for your question.
Just a quick question for Mark, and what are the industry predictions on business travel, and what do they think is going to happen going forward? I know it's almost impossible to predict at this time, but what do they think the situation is going to be?
I mean, technology, we've all been thrown into technology over the last few months. So, video conferencing is obviously going to be a lot more confident throughout businesses. So you may see a reduction in some of the short haul business, maybe even long haul business travel. So it's very difficult to gauge at this stage. I mean, people naturally like to connect. Obviously, we're in the business of travel. We're in the business of connecting people. So whether technology will completely replace meetings, etc., going forward is very difficult to forecast. But obviously, from our perspective, we're working very closely with our corporates and our business travellers to ensure that we do offer the right product and service for them.
Sort of come to the rescue a bit in terms of freight, and be fantastic to hear your experience on the changes that have happened on freight in aviation.
Obviously been at the forefront of our business certainly over the last 2-3 months with all providing important supplies around the world. So we have our own cargo division where we have actually freighters that transport all sorts of things, from racing cars to elephants to zoos, all sorts of things around the world, horses. But we've also been using our passenger aircraft for bringing key supplies to core markets and to keep those corridors open, but also fresh food supplies that have been moving around. So all of those things are important from a air transportation perspective. But obviously, yes, cargo is a very key part of the business.
Thank you, Mark. Simon, I think you had a question.
Well, yes, I was going to say I commend wholeheartedly everything that Mark is saying, and I've heard very similar things from Virgin and EasyJet, and I don't share the views of many in the environmental sector that we shouldn't support these sort of things because it's just hiding the bigger shifts that we need. The bigger shifts, in my view, as a complement to the things Mark is saying, I think we need both, is one, to reduce our own individual carbon footprints, and each of us will do that in our own way. I have different ways to friends and family. Secondly, the carbon offset regime needs to be significantly improved. I've tried to do it and found it very difficult, and lots of the things that I see are heavily criticised. It should be something which is either automatic every time you book a flight, or at the least made as easy as possible, so you just click a button when you're booking a flight. And thirdly and finally, we have to address the aviation fuel anomaly, which seems to be the elephant in the room, the fact that it's just been sitting there at a crazily low level, And flights are embarrassingly cheap. I'm sort of ashamed if I do take a flight, which I have to confess I do from time to time.
Mark, do you want to come back on those points?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult for me sitting here in the industry where we actually fly planes. So obviously from our perspective, we're doing, as I mentioned earlier on, what we can, and obviously there's always room to do more. And we do take this very, very seriously as a company. So obviously from offsetting to also how we package products on board. Sort of making sure that we have biodegradable plastics, etc., or removing plastics. All of those things, from a company's perspective, not just from what customers actually expect, but also what we can do to sort of improve the environment. And as far as fuel price is concerned, obviously, yes, obviously we don't want to be in an environment where fuel prices are high, because obviously that's where we have to pass the price on to the customer. But at the end of the day, I also appreciate the argument that that does generate more travel. So it's a difficult balance. I don't have all the answers, unfortunately.
So challenging changes to navigate ahead, undoubtedly. I've got one more question, and this has come in from one of our viewers via PIM, and that's for Richard. Whether you can expand on why the sort of social and economic fallout from COVID has disproportionately impacted on women, and given that, what some of the solutions might be.
Sure. So I think this is one of the worrying trends we're seeing as a result of COVID-19 is that it is disproportionately impacting women. Now that can be a whole range of things, from, if we think about families working from home where there are suddenly childcare duties, and rightly or wrongly, women are picking up more of the slack on childcare when both parents are working from home. And that's potentially going to have long-term consequences in terms of career development for those women. So that's one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, in a lot of developing countries, in India, parts of South Asia, we're seeing, so almost more worryingly, families where they can no longer afford to send multiple children to school, and again for cultural reasons, for all kinds of historical reasons, it's more likely to be the girls who are pulled out of school. If a family has a boy and a girl and they can only afford to educate one of them, sadly, the fact is a lot of those families choose to educate the boy and not the girl, and that clearly is going to have the more we see that happen right now because of the economic difficulties families and households are facing as a result of the pandemic and lockdown, that's going to have very long-term effects if girls are being pulled out of school.
It reminds me how in West London, many in our community with sort of international familial links send significant remittances to other countries to support their wider families. And of course, as people find themselves furloughed or indeed unemployed, that in itself becomes harder to do, and it's perhaps something for all of us that aren't under those same pressures to think about, perhaps in terms of where we might be making philanthropic contributions at this time. Now I'm going to turn to our fourth theme of the morning, and that is sort of sustainable cities and sort of mobility, to bring in German from the Future Fox. We've known the Future Fox for many years, but we really caught our attention at West London Business with the launch of your tactical space website. So we thought we just had to get you on the programme to tell us more about the project and what inspired it, German.
Yeah, it was really out of the team wanting to help in the best way possible to share knowledge and try to deal with disruption. And the first thing we did was embark in just a simple kind of discovery process by contacting our clients and friends and ex-colleagues and saying that work in transport and planning, and say, what is it that you would really need? And lots of crowdsourcing tools out there, but that's not what really people needed. What people really needed was to know a little bit more about what was happening around the world. And everybody had heard the news about the cycle lanes in Berlin and the cycle lanes in New York and so on and so forth. But they wanted to know a little bit more, and they wanted to have other examples as well. So yeah, very simple. Our developers and our design team just put together the Tactical Space webpage, and the purpose of it is to draw in a little bit of inspiration and yet try to get the wider international community to come together and build a better future.
Now, I think we're going to bring up on screen, German, a few of those examples that you're profiling on the website. But whilst viewers take a look at those, I wonder whether you can tell us a bit more about what you think of the UK government's response in this area, including the sort of pledges that have happened around emergency pop-up bike lanes, wider pavements, bus-only corridors. Is it headed in the right direction, or is there more that needs to be done?
I think it's been absolutely fantastic. If anything, it has been surprising. So we have seen the industry being disrupted really, really quickly. And this is something that, for example, companies like us have been working for a long time and trying to improve the processes. And then we suddenly find ourselves, the normal planning and transport planning processes have been completely disrupted. And one of the things, for example, has disappeared is baseline data. So before you build anything, you need to know what are the baseline levels of traffic, accidents. Well, that's been non-valid for the last 2 months or so. And so also all the tools that are using this baseline data have suddenly, become a little bit challenging to use. And so, we were talking about how difficult it is to predict now. And a lot of the model that's been used previously in the UK around transport and planning has been predicting and providing, and has been dominated by car usage for quite a long time. It has changed over the last couple of years, over the last decade or so. So fortunately, the baseline was there. And the amazing thing that the UK government and some cities specifically have done is adopt a completely new approach. And so rather than trying to predict something that is impossible to predict, they just vision the future and say, this is what we want, this is what our citizens need. They have made the connection between better places and not only transport and the basic urban planning basics, but they've gone well beyond into mental health and having cities that are good for people. And they have taken the plunge and they have used an agile approach. So we've seen this transformation from a very conservative planning, which is there for a reason. I don't want to take merit out of it. It's important. But they've gone from, let's implement something quickly, test it, see where it fails, change it, test it again, and work towards a final product. And this is what the tech industry has been doing for years. And it moves really quickly and really cheap. And so now we're seeing that moving very quickly into the transport planning sector in the UK. And what we wanted to do as a team is help that make the norm. There's incredible challenges going ahead. So, for example, people don't want to put too much change because that might generate pressure on the overall population. We're all going through so much change, and then suddenly seeing change outside your street. So everybody's quite concerned about that. So I think engagement, for example, will become even more important. Then there's the behavioral change issues. We've been talking about people cycling more, people doing more exercise. Will that stay? Will it stay without help, or do we have to put things out there to help this change stay and help the population maintain that new behavior?
I was going to ask you about the sense of how big a change is unfolding before us at the moment. I mean, I've been a cyclist for many years. I've just recently sort of upgraded to get an e-bike, so I can sort of travel longer distances, which has been great fun. And my sense is there are more cyclists out there on the roads of West London. But are you seeing any data sort of coming through to confirm how much the cycling, for example, or walking has increased?
I've heard anecdotal information. I haven't got the figures in front of me. From what I hear, it has increased significantly. Whether that will stay, we don't know. We're monitoring all the cities that are slightly ahead, especially in Asia and China, and see what's going to happen there. I think the latest information from yesterday, for example, was that in cities in China, the level of air pollution has gone back to normal, which is a shame. So I think we can learn from those cities that are a little bit ahead of us and try to make sure that that doesn't happen in the UK. But to answer the question, the change is monumental. I mean, once in a generation. I've been working on transport planning for more than 20 years. Never seen this, never imagined I've seen this. The last time we built a cycle lane, I worked on the cycle superhighways. It took the best part of 4 years to build one. And it was a team of about 100 people or so. And now suddenly you see this happening really quickly. Not to take merit out of the people that were working on it before, they were working on the different rules. Today, the rules have changed. How they will become normal, we don't know. And that's where we as citizens, as businesses, and as professionals need to make everything possible so that those rules remain, and then we can build better cities faster.
An incredibly exciting time, as you say, and this sudden arrival of sort of agile working in local government, city government, which is making things happen so much faster, has been great to see. Now, I'm sure if viewers have got additional case studies, they should no doubt get in touch with you to provide new content to Tactical Space. We're all out there with our smartphones now, so it's very easy to find that best practice and share it. We may well be coming back to you, German, later with in some of our sort of final round of questions, but I'm going to turn now to Harriet for a bit of a micro business perspective on what life has been like through COVID-19. I'm going to bring up on the screen for our viewers just a slide with lots and lots of numbers, but perhaps the important numbers in that sea of information is that across our 7 northwest London boroughs, there are 95,000 micro businesses with 0 to 4 employees. And that, of course, will include lots of creative businesses, sole traders like yourself, Harriet. In Hammersmith and Fulham, there are 10,770 of those micro businesses, of which you're one. So I wonder if you can give us a bit of a flavour of what COVID-19 has been like for you thus far.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the changes to our industry actually started to happen a little bit sooner than lockdown, so January, with our exit from the European Union and the impact that had on our European touring. So the arts rely on 2 models, either the American philanthropic model or the European state-funded model. So Germany, for example, their venues are funded 70 to 80% by the government and only rely on 20 to 30% ticket sales. And so they will be able to recover from COVID a lot quicker than we will, because they can afford to run at half to 3/4 full, whereas the Royal Opera House, for example, requires to be 95% to open.
Wow.
So we, in the arts, have a huge gap to fill for quite some time. And a live concert, by definition, needs a lot of people in a small and confined space. How do we do that? How do we bring music to people? How do we continue to have businesses as musicians? And how do we be useful at this time? And I think that the emergency funding, for example, the German government given of 50 billion has been incredibly useful. The creative industries alone to the UK economy contribute 111 billion a year. So we are an important industry to protect. And so we're all trying to find creative ways around this, even with streaming. 5 million streams makes you £12.34. So it really is critical to have some of that support and to have philanthropic support, because if we have neither model, we have nowhere to sort of fill that space.
So some big some big structural challenges for the UK compared with other markets around the world. And your point around the significance of the creative sector, we've been highlighting at West London Business that last year it really was very much the creative media screen sort of industry in the wider UK, but also West London importantly, that helped keep the UK economy out of recession, because actually it was the creative and media sector that was still growing. So really, I think really important for us to not lose that as we plan for recovery. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've sort of improvised in sort of setting up your free concerts for local residents, and how did that idea come about?
Yeah, so there's been two ways in which I've really chosen to use this time and make it as creatively inspiring and helpful as can be. So one of those ways is with these concerts that I've been doing every day, which came quite organically out of me leaving New York for the lockdown, because I wanted to be with my instrument in a country that I had access to healthcare, etc. And I often usually come back in August and learn new rep for the season. So I notice that people gather outside my window and listen. I'm on a ground floor, which actually used to be a post office. So I've got 9 windows going round and an intersection of 4 major streets. And a lot of the residences have balconies all the way down these 4 roads. So it's really kind of almost set up like a gallery. And so I thought, well, what about if, one of the major changes is that we've lost routine and routines that people clung to really understand what their week looked like. And so if it was the same time every day, would that be something that people reacted to? And they really did. And I've now done 35 of these concerts. I do them every day at 5 o'clock. I get 40 plus people outside the window. I have an amp that was lent to me by Gene Stevenson, the Alarm, so that it can travel as far as possible, so that people aren't breaking social distancing. And it's been really, really exciting. It's got quite a lot of press coverage and people have really enjoyed it. But I think more importantly, everyone has somewhere to go at some point during the day and knows that they will see other people, whether they live alone or whatever it is. And it also is a real testament to the hunger for a live experience and how desperate people are to get that back.
Yeah,
and I've had so many amazing comments. Yeah. I've had people baking me cakes, bringing me flowers, making me chutney, all sorts of wonderful things. Who just want to say thank you, and who always say, how can I contribute? How can I do something? And I think
a new bartering economy emerging out of the post office that is now your stage. It's wonderful to see and hear. And I think we're going to bring up on screen now a bit of information on the website. Is it Patreon that you've recently set up on? You've obviously also got your own website with lots more information about your work. Can you tell us briefly about Patreon and the sort of membership levels that people can now sign up to support your work?
Yes. So Patreon is really the best platform that we have at the moment to interact with our audience and to show what we're doing and to make them a part of the creative process that we never could before. So at different tiers, there's different benefits, and it's a monthly package. So you don't pay for anything that you access, you just pay whichever tier that you sign up for. So there's live Q&As, people can request for me to learn something or be talked through the process of something that they want to learn specifically. They may have had a life ambition to learn one piece and it's locked down and they're not going to be going down for a while and they just want to learn that piece and they want to know how it would be approached. That's a service that I offer. Or access to VIP, and when events come back, being able to do meet and greets. But this is the closest thing to that in the meantime. Phone calls with updates, support on their work, contributing to mine. And I think that that's the best sense of community that's really music specific that we can have at the moment, and it's really exciting. I'm really enjoying it.
Really sort of redefining in a sort of very 21st century way your relationship with your fans and audience, which is lovely to see. And I should say, for any viewers looking forward to hearing you play, stay tuned, because in sort of around 10 minutes you'll be playing us out at the end of the programme, which we're all very much looking forward to. Thank you so much for joining us today on the programme, Harriet. We're going to turn now, staying at this sort of micro level, to Tony, to talk us a bit around how businesses might, as a result of this shock, start planning for a more resilient future, which is, I think, probably a theme we'll be returning to and unpacking in much more detail with Tony on future programmes. But I wonder whether you can give us a bit of a flavour, Tony, of how you think businesses are changing their thinking, particularly when it comes to business continuity planning and disaster recovery 3 months into this crisis.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. You're right. It is a conversation you could probably have a whole session on, to talk through the impact of COVID virus and BCP and how we make our businesses more resilient. I think listening to Richard talk about the sort of top and emerging risks that Volan have identified, that gives businesses a flavour of where the direction of travel might be about things they need to consider in their future planning. And then BCP, that's really about making your business resilient, and it is similar to an insurance policy. You invest in it and you're going to have some risks that you're trying to mitigate by investing in your business continuity planning, your disaster recovery, and you're looking to say, well, the cost of investing in this, what's the benefit I get out of it? So some businesses might say, I've been through this with COVID, I don't really need it because actually I just shut my shop and walked away. That might be their entire plan. But other businesses may have other ideas about, well, what do they need to do? Do they need to look at their supply chain? And what are the risks in their supply chain? And how do we make our supply chain more resilient rather than efficient? Because you're trading off, again, efficiency in your supply chain versus resilience. And what are your plans around, supporting your supply chain and understanding the risks that you're running, and how do you invoke those contingencies? So there are some of the thoughts that are sort of coming out from this conversation this morning.
I was very struck, Tony. We're going to bring up a slide that you shared with us in advance around how the world has changed since the start of 2020. And I think this slide sort of flags that survey data suggested back in February that 85% of respondents said that they didn't have a business continuity plan in place. Well, I'd imagine there's been an awful lot of very fast writing of business continuity plans, even if on the back of an envelope. What's your sense of where businesses are at today, other than the kind of constant pivoting and sort of reinvention of business models?
Yeah, I think that was a very interesting stat. I was very surprised by that as well, but it backed up some anecdotal evidence I've been hearing about people applying for the SIBLs and the BIBLs, where their business plans weren't in place to even put in an application to get the funding that they were looking for. So I think people have done a lot of work to catch up, and now they're sort of looking at this coming out of it and they're saying, well, what do we need to do to make sure that if this happens again, we've got the right processes and procedures in place to manage it? And I think, part of this challenge is looking at it and saying, well, do we need this? Is it going to cost us money? What do we need to do? And risk identification is going to be critical to that activity, and to think about the furlough scheme. So the governor has said unconditionally, if your staff are furloughed, we'll pay 80% of their wages up to a certain amount, and they just did that. If this happens again, the government may say, well, you can have the money if you meet these conditions. And so some of your continuity planning might be around taking on board those conditions and what you need to have in place to demonstrate, your business viability under those conditions. So these are things that I think are going to come out, and people need to start thinking about, well, what would happen if it happened again and the government said, I'm only going to pay 50% of your wages, for example.
It does feel to me like there are a lot of professional disciplines, whether it's specialists in business continuity planning and risk management, internal audit, financial leaders, sustainability experts in larger firms, that are having to converge their professional practice at this time in a way we perhaps haven't seen before. And I think we're going to bring up a slide
True.
From Resilience First, one of our partner organisations. In a report they've just published, they sort of flagged these much broader themes of identity and how businesses connect with their community and neighbours, maturity of an organisation's capacity to cope with local disruption, and their list goes on. And I imagine these are the sorts of questions that you'd be wanting clients to ask themselves as they put together refreshed business continuity plans.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. This is a great document to start from, to look at and say, well, in some ways, I'm looking at point 6, agility, as being how committed to you are you to learning the lessons and the continuous learning, as being almost point 1, is to start at that point and say, well, what did we learn in this crisis? What lessons do we need to take out of that, and what do we need to change? What did we do well? Where do we need to consider doing things differently? Do I have a valid business model coming out of this? If I'm a restaurant, how do I make a nice ambient restaurant if I need to maintain social distancing, if everybody's sitting in plastic booths? So there's all these sorts of questions that businesses need to start asking themselves, and it comes out of what have you learned over the last 3 months, and then how do you bring that back into your planning and your sort of the world you operate in, and where do you fit? And I think this is a great starting point, and there'll definitely be the questions I'm asking people as I meet with them, say, well, what are you doing to make sure you're able to start up again?
I think we've got one last slide I'm going to pull up around disaster recovery. And it struck me that, as IT has become so central in all of our work in recent weeks, that technology recovery piece may be one of the first areas that businesses turn to as they try and get into more detailed continuity planning.
That's definitely a key topic, Andrew, because the way people work these days, most of my work is done either here sitting in my office, or I take my smartphone with me and I can send emails, I can check on what's happening outside of the office, but also dual authentication and other activities like this happen on my phone. Now, if my phone is lost and I haven't got my OneDrive and my iCloud backup and my Google Drive with all of that data on there, suddenly I don't know how to run my business, because all of my email contacts are lost, or I can't log into my account because I can't do the dual authentication. And even a simple thing might be having the phone numbers for my 6 key customers, and I need to ring up and say, oh, by the way, we've just had a problem and I've got to go and sort a few things out, and this is the issue, and I've got to get a new phone, and I'll be back to you in 3 days, because they might be expecting things from you. So again, the technology plays such an important part of our world, but it's about the data. It's always been about the data and making sure your data is protected and safe and accessible under those disaster conditions. And they're the things you need to consider in that space.
Some really helpful prompts there, Tony, and really, I suppose, in those sorts of plans, and I suppose robust, resilient business planning is where we kind of translate all of those macro concerns that we discussed at the start of the programme back down to the local level and the everyday lives of keeping our businesses going successfully. As I said, I think we'll be picking up on this in much more detail with you and other experts in the field in the weeks ahead. I've had one more question that has come in from our viewers, and I think this is another question that Pim is encouraging me to put perhaps to Richard, but give me a wave if anyone else wants to come in on it, and that's around the circular economy. This sort of notion that's come out from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and is popping up in lots of conversations, and we're now seeing integrated into the plans of many of our local authorities in West London. The sort of question from Pim and viewers is whether, in your view, it's a completely new sustainability paradigm that's going to drive a lot more change. Richard?
Well, the idea has been around for quite a while in different forms. Before Ellen MacArthur talked about circular economy, we had cradle to cradle as a kind of design concept being used across a wide range of industries. So I don't think it's a new concept, but I think it is a very important concept, and one that we need to build into really every industry. I think a lot of the focus when we think about circular economy tends to be on issues like plastic packaging, which is important. And we've seen the massive problems with plastic ending up in the oceans, and we need to think about how to close those loops so that waste packaging is becoming a resource for new materials. But this isn't just about plastic packaging. This is about our built environment, how we and it's not purely about recycling. It's about how we design things to be durable, how we design things for reuse, for repurposing, and really kind of recycling materials is the last option in that. So I think it's not a new paradigm, but it is a really important one, and certainly one that already we're seeing signals in certain places that post-COVID, circular economy will be an important part of the recovery.
Now that feels like a really fitting place for us to end today's programme during Circular Economy Week. And of course, any viewers that would like more support in their businesses around that transition to clean tech and the circular economy, do get in touch with us at any time, and we can link you up with our colleagues in the Better Futures Clean Tech programme, but also our partners at Advanced London, which provides specialist support for businesses going down a circular economy route. Our time is up, even on this extended 90-minute episode. It has flown by. It falls to me, as always, to say a big thank you to my production team here at West London Business, Pim and Janelle, as well as Joel, our AV technician at Revolution Audio. A huge thank you to my panel today, Mark Davey, UK Sales and Marketing Manager at Singapore Airlines, German Dekter Vega, co-founder of the Future Fox, Simon Holmes, member of the UK Competition Appeal Tribunal and visiting fellow at the Centre for Competition Law and Economics, Tony Mulverhill, Managing Director at Planning for the Best, and Richard Roberts, Inquiry Lead at Volans, as well as, of course, Harriet Stubbs, concert pianist. As always, continue to share your thoughts with us and visit coronavirus.westlondon.com for the latest information and support. You can speak to a human being about your concerns by calling 020 8607 2500. And if you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, please click on the button below the video stream to stay informed and show your support for our work. Talk at 10 is taking a week's break, so diarise the 18th of June at 10 for our next episode. But this time next week, West London Business will be webcasting our first 5-minute leaders briefing. Until then, we wish you, your friends, family and colleagues good health, and please maintain social distancing wherever possible to stay safe. To play us out today, Harriet is going to perform Life on Mars, a sneak preview from her next album, which will be released when our community has fully remobilised. Harriet.
time.